I'm Kayla Dice, and this is Your Life Path. I'm an out-of-control tabletop role-playing game designer, and on this show I talk to TTRPG designers and other exciting guests about everything that inspires or influences them away from role-playing. My guest today is a writer and designer whose work is often focused on travel and the supernatural, the wonderfully talented Yanahn. Hello and
Hey,
welcome.
everybody.
Thank you for coming on the podcast. Would you like to
Yeah.
introduce yourself more fully to the audience, say some of the things you've worked on that you're proud of?
Okay, yeah. First of all, thanks so much for the opportunity to be on here. Really appreciate it. And yeah, so intro-wise, I'm Yanahn. I'm a Malaysian tabletop games designer. I'm currently based in the UK. A lot of the work I do tends to be looking into, say, supernatural things. I'm just very fascinated by urban legends, by the mildly supernatural uncanniness that kind of permeates our reality. It sounds pretentious, but hopefully the rest of this will help explain why. Stuff I'm really proud of is, well, Stories to Astonish the World. That was, I think, the first big RPG project I did. It's a Chinese landscape painting road trip sort of game. And my two more recent works were Unhaunt This House and also the Night Market Pocket Zine. The Night Market Pocket Zine is a mini setting about a market where you can trade with the dead. And also, Unhaunt This House is about a sort of haunted house Ghostbusters type game where you play like specter hunters exploring heavily distorted houses, mansions, haunted aquarium, haunted courthouse, any sites where you think like a lot of grudges or supernatural anomalies might coalesce, and some you might not expect. Actually, that's the joy of it.
Yeah, I think your work often has a real fascination and interest with the supernatural, which we'll ask a bit more about. But also, I do just love the way it's all from so many sort of different directions.
Yeah.
Stories to Astonish the World, you feel like you're really sort of embedded almost in the supernatural. With Unhaunt This House and the Night Market, it's more like you're a visitor, and then all of your stuff is really it's really just characterful, which is great.
Thank you.
To interact with. So starting off with a sort of biographical questions, you mentioned you're Malaysian. Where did you grow up in Malaysia?
Oh, yeah. I grew up in one of the small suburban towns in the vicinity of Kuala Lumpur. So Kuala Lumpur is the capital city, and I think within a 45-kilometer drive distance, you get a lot of smaller towns. There are people where a lot of people there either commute in to work in the city, or they're just close enough that you can go there on Sundays or something like that. It was an old my hometown was, I think, built on this odd combination of government policies that pushed a lot of a specific cultural group into an area, bit morbidly, and also mining towns. So you can see one of the shopping malls in my hometown was built straight up right next to a mining lake. They've turned into a tourist resort and a shopping mall with boat cruises on it now.
Do you find yourself thinking, because I think you have such a sort of distinctiveness with locations and settings, there's a real sense of place. Do you feel like in a lot of the places you're writing about your hometown ever, or do you think it's more just, is it a more generalized influence, or is it one where you've not necessarily ever noticed how that might have had an impact?
Oh yeah, actually, it's funny that you asked this because I think it's I take a sort of two-pronged approach. So one of the approaches is pretty hometown related. I kind of got in one of the strands I was following when I was learning the ropes of designing RPGs was following the work of RPG Southeast Asia, and also I think burgeoning writers is say Malaysian or Southeast Asian writers as they try and wrangle with the idea of writing about hometown things and how to approach that if you're marketing to a non-hometowny audience. So some of my works, I think Operation Highland Exodus is, while not specifically my hometown, draws from the sort of library of urban legends that coalesced around the sort of Titiwangsa mountain range, about 5 hours drive from where I used to live, which was quite which was it which is interest which was a really interesting hodgepodge of casinos on mountains, colonial hill resorts probably haunted, and horrible twisting highways that are kind of dangerous, and small towns where you can get a nice meal. So I mean, to sum it up, I might be rambling a bit, but yeah, one of the approaches I take with some of the games I do is try and embed a bit of my like hometown or a bit of a sort of unusual bit that informs the writing that might probably be consciously or unconsciously influenced by Southeast Asia, depending on like how much of kind of putting into it.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting and makes a lot of sense. You did just mention briefly there like the questions about like writing for a non-Southeast Asian audience, or at least writing with an awareness of a non-Southeast Asian audience. Is that how do you think that affects your choices in terms of consciously or unconsciously bringing stuff in? Yeah, and I guess like how do you feel about that nature of thing?
Yeah. I think like so I was kind of in two minds about like it because I know like I've been because like with the works in I've seen with RPG Southeast Asia or with Southeast Asian writers, there is a debate about like how much do you explain to or assume that you're writing for a global, more westernized audience, and I think I've definitely been pivoting. I think it depends on the intent. If it's very much like a educational element, if there's a slight educational angle, like with stories, I chose not to explain like the Chinese literature aspects or the tropes and archetypes too much, but included like a sort of bibliography so people could find the paintings and the text I got some of the ideas from. And then with stuff that's a bit harder to substantiate, that's more like urban legend related, I've been trying to figure out like, yeah, maybe I might not need to explain such too much. Maybe it's something, we could I mean, I kind of swing on the general direction now where it's like Google and the internet exists and there's a lot more Southeast Asian people wandering around talking about these things. So if I don't if it feels like say understanding is needed to get the irony or the point, I will probably explain a little. But if it isn't or it doesn't or like say with the night market and the needles the needle related witch, like the needle witch in that one, which indirectly references like a type of folk magic, I just didn't really want to explain, partially because it's I'm not as familiar with it. My only like awareness of it came from like newspaper rumors or the odd rumor here and there. So some of it. So I guess short form is if it feels like it's important to get the point, I'd explain it. If not, I'm tempted to leave it. And if it's not something I'm that close to, or if it's something I'm touch and go with, I try not to make it too big, a too big part of the work, and I don't explain it either. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. A sort of sense of trusting your audience of like if you're interested in more, you're capable of your own research. And you as the writer don't necessarily owe the audience like a deeper hand holding in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, at the risk of being a bit stereotypical, as I grew up, and some of the books I read were stuff like Edith Blyton, and no one was around to explain to like what 8-year-old Kristen what a licorice all sort was, and I was like, "Huh, that's a candy." I'm like, okay, moving on.
Yeah, like people can enjoy art even without having this sort of full context, but also if you're in certain demographics, maybe you should be experiencing sort of some, I don't know everything and need to learn more of my own accord in that sense.
Yeah.
Do you have a clear sort of memory of what you wanted to be when you were growing up?
Oh yeah. It was I think it changed depending on when you talk to me, but I think there was a lot of like the fancy sciencey academic-y careers. So like archaeologist, marine biologist for a while until I realized I didn't actually like diving and wasn't that keen on going into the ocean too heavily. And I was like, okay, maybe not.
I
Spent
can
a
see how
good
that's a
chunk
deal
of.
breaker.
Hmm?
I can see how that's a deal breaker for
Yeah, I was
marine
like,
biology.
no, the 100%. Then I think I was really keen on doing history academically, but I think after a while I looked at the situation personally, and I think it wasn't really something I could commit to. The whole like, uh, undergrad, master's, PhD, postdoctoral fellow, scramble to find a job in a long time frame wasn't something I could fully commit to given personal situations. So I moved on from that. But yeah, that was the general trend. You can see a very researchy, academic-y adjacent focus.
And do you think that sort of interest in sort of like areas of research and stuff, do you think that informs your work in some ways? I remember you mentioned like, oh, unless I'm doing something educational, do you think there's an educational quality to some of your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thread line that came with me from that was just that I like being able to share things with people about like unusual or odd things about our reality, about the way we live. So a lot of the I think when I was still looking at the archaeology history, public history sort of path, I think one of the joys I had was volunteering at an archaeology museum in my university and just being able to tell people, check that out, that is cool, you might be a little lost in this pile of artifacts, but this like specific figurehead shows like evidence of trade because it was a dragon figurehead with Chinese porcelain cups as the eyes, like that sort of like it was just like. So this is an attitude I bring to games as well. So some games, it's when I say educational, it's less didactic, less teachy, and more. This is an environment that is neat, and I have a lot of fun facts, and the fun facts will be part of the adventure in some way. So that's what I'm thinking of when I'm writing the sort of deep ocean fantasy adventure. There's gonna be a lot of weird marine life that sort of NPCs like fish folk based on the weird marine life. You might see like towns where where like undersea towns that are based on, say, ecosystems like geothermal vents, which are large communities in the deep sea that are full of life and have weird creatures on them, stuff like, and so completely subsist without sunlight. They draw energy from the hydrothermal vents themselves. Um, yeah, so a lot of one of the sort of impetus when I'm picking a setting or designing a setting comes from that, like, this is a cool thing or a cool area or region or historical tidbit, and I'd like to share it with y'all through the medium of game.
Yeah, that sort of that sense of excitement to share in second learning, I think really comes through in your work. And is the deep sea adventure you're talking about, is that what you had the preview of at Dragon Meet?
Yes, it's the the Enter the Whalefall zine. So currently working through it right now. Had to negotiate around the day job to keep writing it because I think the first whale like corpse leviathan dungeons but nearly done, and had the lovely opportunity to work with Molamut for a really cool map that's coming to the zine now. So
That's really
exciting
exciting.
times. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know roughly, do you have an idea of when that might be out? And I can try and guess relative to when this podcast episode will air.
That's the thing. I think it's subject to. So I'm aiming to try and get it out by this year, but it might end up being like late this year in quarter three more than anything else because when my day job basically decided to um there was a bit of a change in the departments, which means I recently joined a new team, so things got a lot more hectic.
Yeah. And so juggling things of that makes complete sense. But yeah, I'm really excited to see it when it comes out.
Yeah, really excited to share it. Had some real. I think that that sort of excitement I think you picked up on. It's something. It's one of the joys of just being able to design, like being an indie sort of tabletop game designer. Because I remember like tabling at like talking to people at conventions, and there were definitely people who there was definitely the one person who's like saw it and was like, "Oh, weird fish." I was like, "Yes, weird fish," and then we were just going same hat, marine biology. Yes.
I love when you're pitching something at someone and you just catch the level they're getting it on.
Yeah.
Where you're like, oh yeah, no, this is for you. In a way
Yeah.
it's maybe not even for everyone else here. Like they might like it, but I can tell you get this thing about it. So
Yes.
what did you do when you finished school?
Oh, so this is the. I don't think it was anything particularly dramatic, cause I finished uni with and then went to go basically do the thing that a lot of my friends did, which was go find a grad scheme, attempt to get on a grad scheme, and then attempt to get an office job, which is thankfully it worked out okay because honestly I'm very thankful because my graduating year was 2020.
Yeah, that's when I was doing my teacher training, which was a weird one.
Oh.
because then they're
my
like, okay, so
sympathies,
the later
yeah.
half of your year is you go to a school, and then they're like, you are legally not allowed to go to a school.
Oh
Or
no.
So we just did a bunch of like improvised lessons from teachers who were not planning to be, from like professors who were not planning to do that. What did you end up studying at university in the end?
Oh, I actually did end up getting to do history. Got to do a sort of wide range of the like. Hmm?
I was just
Oh, sorry.
not.
Yes. Oh yeah, got to do a wide range of like historical subjects. My university basically said like you have to do 2 British history papers. And I was like, cool. I get to pick the time period, right? They're like, yes. And I was like, well, time to do Vikings, I guess. They offered like early medieval, early modern, and modern, and I took like, and I don't think I was the only one. There were probably a lot of people who I've talked to who were very tutored out by UK high school in general. So yeah,
Yeah.
um, got to cover some modern American history, some Southeast Asian history, some other like I think East Asian history as well, bit of Europe. It was a wide range, but I think it was nice, and I got more weird facts about life, the way people tend to live, which was good. Also, I think practiced a
Yeah.
lot about writing. Mm-hmm.
That is also a useful skill, yeah. And I can see that appreciation for like a wide range of history in your work. So was university when you first moved to the UK?
Yes, um I think like a lot of the sort of middle class ish milieu that I lived in Malaysia, there was an expectation that if you could and you had the wherewithal and the situation that enabled you to do this, it was worth going overseas to study. So yeah, before then I hadn't left Malaysia before, and then suddenly I was like, okay, arrive in a foreign country, get ready to figure out what university is like. Yes, it's quite
That
nice though.
makes, and yeah, but also does sound like a really big, huge change at a formative period in life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, university is also. Oh, sorry. Yes.
Oh no, you go on.
Oh yeah. University was also amusingly enough where I got the chance to start getting involved in tabletop gaming. Cause my high school in Malaysia, like there are places in Malaysia where you can get involved in tabletop gaming, but my high school was not one of them. So I arrived in uni and saw, oh okay, they have tabletop game societies here. Rejoice.
So were you into tabletop RPGs before while you were in Malaysia, but was it a thing of like, oh, I like the idea of this, but I don't have an opportunity to get into it? Or was your discovery of RPGs at university?
I think before I came here, I was like aware of the concept. So, you know, you watch enough pop cultural entertainment, you sort of realize, oh yeah, Dungeons and Dragons exists. It's a thing. But I think arriving in the UK and getting involved with like people in the tabletop game society was how I specifically got involved in like, oh yes, there's so this is how the games work. This is how like some of the norms tend to be like. There are other games beyond the Dungeons and Dragons mega corporation hegemony thing, and it was like, oh yeah. So, and someone like you walk in and there'd be people going, oh, Legend of the Five Rings is we're running a Legends of the Five Rings game, or I paint Warhammer minis, or Pathfinder. I'm trying to recall what else I ran into. There was still a lot of Dungeons and Dragons in the earlier stages, but then I met more people, and then there'd be people playing like Blades in the Dark or Pathfinder to Second Edition, or writing their own things, and then it became, oh okay, there's a whole universe out there.
Yeah, absolutely. When did you first get to that point of going, oh yeah, I could write my own things as well?
Actually, so that happened around 2020. So when the pandemic hit, and I think the tabletop server that I was in kind of moved online, and then people started getting involved in jams, like game jams, and sharing their like projects. And I think that's when like I think I was watching a few people get involved in game jams and talk through like, oh, this is what I'm designing, or this is what I'm making, and through chatting with them. So amusingly enough, this is where like I met Laurie, Laurie O'Connell, because yeah, I think he and Bats ran a game jam on painting, like the paintings jam. I think he and Bats were collaborating on the paintings jam, and he had submit, and that was I think I had previously written a few small things like like based on a friend system like Nakade, who's I think currently on itch, like based on a friend system. And then the paintings jam, I think, was when it really like hit the okay, I can make this an official thing. And that's when I wrote like the first draft of stories to Astonish the World, because I was staring at it and going, like Chinese landscape paintings are really cool. And I think it was like a twin conversation thing going on. One was the paintings jam happening, and then me having middle of the pandemic conversations with a very nice person who was translating or reading Chinese like classical literature excerpts. And then they sort of fused together and went, oh, okay, I could make a game related to that. And the paintings would help a lot, because it's nice to have like a sort of way to convey the scene beyond just having to like find ways to describe it. Being able to have a visual aid to things and also showcase some nice 19th century, 18th century paintings. So yeah, I think that's when it started, like about 2020, 2021, when all the game jams were happening. And when you're inside and trying to take your mind off of the pandemic.
I feel there is a distinctive slice of almost like lockdown era designers you can somewhat notice in some cases, but
yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
I think the combination of like turning those paintings into a point scroll is so intuitive, but also so sort of like rich in terms of what there is to be engaging with there, like both as a player or just reading through and exploring the space. So yeah, and speaking of like game jams, this was a later question, but I think it's really appropriate there, because I was going to say a lot of your work has been done as part of game jams. So you mentioned the paintings jam. I think Unhaunt This House was for Down We Go jam. And
the Down We Go jam.
I guess I wondered if you could expand a bit on what it is about like that jam space that attracts you. Is it the opportunity to be creating almost as part of like a micro scene of lots of people all exploring a similar space, or is there something else that appeals to you about that as a thing that does just get you going, cool, what am I excited to be working on?
Yeah, honestly, yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's like jams kind of gather like a group of people who are all sort of semi on the same page and having a interested in having like a really big fervent discussion. And it's nice to be able to like bounce ideas off people in a sort of, while also working, like that, okay, there's like this cliche saying like limitations breed creativity, but having like the theme of the jam to bounce off, or being able to chat through things with people with like a bit of a yardstick to start the convo really helped. So like I think a more recent experience was the Silt versus adventure like assignment and playbook contest that the Gauntlet people were hosting. I didn't manage to get my entry done in time due to the aforementioned day jobbing, but it was that similar thing, being able to like be on that Discord, being on that like forum Discord and having that chat as people sort of go, oh yeah, I'm riffing on the idea of religiosity this way, or so, versus like and then you flick to the next forum and there'll be someone going, I want to make the ice cream man god. What if there was a page? What if you took an ice cream truck, an ice cream man, that concept, and took it to its logical deific extremes? I'm just like, that helps. That was, yeah, it was like, right. That makes sense, I guess. All archetypes are archetypes. Yeah.
It's interesting, yeah, because I was also someone who all of my early work was essentially made in jam scenarios. And then, yeah, I feel like it was because otherwise I didn't necessarily have a way or a structure in terms of how I was, like what I wanted to do. And so it definitely makes sense. And yeah, it's just an interesting space. So a question I've been asking everyone on this season of the podcast is, do you remember when you first considered yourself a writer?
Oh, that's gonna be an awkward one. Well, not awkward. It's just a bit hard to pin down.
Yeah, it's the reason I posed this one as do you remember, because I feel a lot of people's answer might be no, I don't remember.
Yeah, I don't think there was like an actual point. I could probably like sort of backtrack it to when I first started like having to like introduce myself as, okay, actually this might be it. This might like when I was initially getting involved in projects, I think when you turn up at a game jam, there's not much of an intro. But then like when you get involved in like Discord forums and they have an intro channel, then you have to think, oh, what do I say? Like, what is this? Well, not exactly. It's not really a persona you have to craft, but it is just like a brief, quick intro to you. And I think that's when I
An
started using
explanation
like
like
writer or
what's your
designer.
deal? Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. I'm not trying to think, yeah, because I reckon probably one of the earliest times I would have like written the words like Kayla is a game designer would have been in doing a bio for something. Either like you're saying a Discord intro or like whatever I first wrote on my itch page.
Oh yes.
Because it was
Yeah.
probably a few games before I like wrote the itch page.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and well, though was this thing? Because the other thing is, you know, when you first consider yourself a designer, but are those so like intuitively interlinked for you?
Yeah, pretty much, I think. Like, I know there's probably some people who maybe designer might be more of a mechanical standpoint, and writer might be more, oh, I write for things or setting, but I don't really see a very hard and fast dichotomy between the two. Yeah. So
Yeah, it
I
makes
kind of
sense. Especially with your work, where I feel the like elements that people might like try and like shear off as this is writing and this is design, where it's is are really interlinked in your work, where it's like the setting is informing how stuff is happening as well as what's
Mhm.
happening. So I can completely understand why it's like these don't feel like separate things.
Yeah. Hmm.
So we talked about this next question a bit already because I was asking about like things you felt had informed your sense of place and stuff. I was going to say like
Yes.
a lot of your work focuses on unique settings and odd locales, and yeah, there is this sense of place to everything. And I'd asked before about like, oh, how did you feel it was informed by where you grew up? But also, I was just in general wondering, what's your approach when you're devising a setting, whether that's for the night market or whether that's for devising an individual haunt, or the description of the sort of the landscapes and stories to astonish the world. Yeah, like, do you have like a methodology or things you first go to that anchor a setting in your mind?
So I don't think there's like a first. So I think there've been a few approaches. I don't think there's really one set approach. So sometimes, like, say it's I saw or read about something that was interesting. So stories came partially from the Chinese classical literature I explored with friends from the Ancient Literature Society back at uni. Um, Night market. The night market's a funny one because it came from like a half remembered urban. So there were urban legend collections, the True Singapore Ghost Stories series when I was a kid, and one of them, and they would just basically like I think people would just write in weird urban legends, and one of them was the idea that like you could make some money by taking bags of salt and going to cemeteries at night and selling salt to the deceased. I don't know where that urban legend came from, but it was in that book, and I was like, huh, that seems like an interesting thing. And even now, I think a lot of it comes from stuff I read, uh, and it's a bit hard to pin down if there's a pattern. A lot of it is just, oh, this looks interesting, or this is cool. So, like, say like the Whalefall adventure came from. I think reading a lot of marine biology, National Geographic articles, and then finding, I think at the right time, this one marine biology book by someone who builds submersibles to study bioluminescence in the deep sea open ocean. And I was just like, wait, you know, some of it I think also comes from like things that have been percolating around. I do have like a tendency to put like living living architecture or distorted or moving scenery in like or just like slightly animated scenery and environments in the stuff I do, but I think that just comes from like a personal sort of fascination with like I think the way people move through space and the way other things like animate space. Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting contrast. Like, yeah, when a setting is moving, I think it can feel like a way a person might be lost in a
Mhm.
space, but really like literalized almost. Um, I like, I yeah, I also
Yeah.
I noticed I made a joke recently about like how all I write is just shifting dreamscapes. Like this is self parody at this point. It's always shifting dreamscapes. It's never a map.
I mean, like, I
That's
remember seeing like Old Gods and Young Guns, and I was like, oh, it was that one was very like it was really cool to me. Part of that was because I find the shifting dreamscapes energy, it resonates. But also, this is a fun fact. I was the kid who read way too much DC superheroes Wikipedia. I went down like several DC superheroes Wikipedia like holes, and then I hit like the Mr. Miracle, Scott Free, and that new like that DC Pantheon. So when I saw this, like, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people could be like, "Oh, you're doing that," like, because it's doing that so much.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was also the same with like Wikipedia dives. Like that was really what my intro to comics was more than anything else. But yeah,
no, I feel that comics were expensive in Malaysia. You just go, I'll read Wikipedia a bit.
Yeah. Just wait until like, if they updated Wikipedia after like this month or whatever.
Yeah.
Before we get too off track though, in the back of Operation Highland X, you said you enjoyed writing travel adventure games, and travel plays a major role in many of your. And I was interested in like the sort of different shapes the figure of like the traveler can take, because it's very different, say like the tourist versus someone who is like journeying for home or something. And I was wondering if you saw there as being like a specific perspective with travel in your work. And I guess also from this conversation, I was wondering, do you feel like your view and attraction to like travel adventure games is informed by having, moved country at a, comparatively young age?
Yeah. Actually, yes. The question actually hits on an interesting thing. I was thinking of it's a through line that I was thinking about, because with stories, there was like, I think, an intent. The reason why I made those playbooks, like not playbooks, like the pseudo like personas archetypes that you build characters out of and try to embed them in the setting a bit, was because at the time, in the back of my mind, there was a bit of I sure dang hope it isn't going to come off touristy. Like, yes, you're traveling and you're adventuring through this weird place, this made with like odd people, other locations, but the hope with that one is with the archetypes, it helps guide the idea that no, you are also a slightly odd person with odd skills, and you are a part of this milieu together. And
you're traveling here, but you belong to this world in some way still.
Yeah, because like it's something I was thinking about when I was, because like the idea of the adventure as like a disconnected party of people who wander into a weird place and get involved in weird shenanigans is, I think it's something that comes up a lot in like when in like fantasy adventure stuff. I mean, like I was trying, and it's something that I was just puzzling over, because I did like when I'm writing stuff, I think it's sure, the locations are weird, but I write it from like a perspective and a hope that conveyed alongside that is the idea that this isn't a weird for people to gawk at. This is a weird that is a different group of people with different norms, but they're still like doing their own thing. And
I feel there's almost a tone in a lot of the weirdness of like, isn't it wonderful to be able to experience things different than what you knew, rather than isn't this strange or uncomfortable?
Yeah, like when I'm talking, like I think it was that part of it, I think, comes from like historical stuff. Like when I was researching Southeast Asian history, and in say like 19th century, like 20th century or 19th century like Singapore and Malaysia, there's, I guess, like, okay, I'm gonna limit it to this example because I know that history stuff can be sensitive in terms of the cognitive dissonance of history and the cognitive resonance of history. But there was definitely like a feeling seeing like seeing like people, those like Singaporean Chinese folks who are writing their newsletters and trying to get to grips with like what does being Singaporean mean, what does being Chinese mean in a very colonized, westernized society. And I saw that and I went, yeah, I mean, it's an issue that we're all still grappling with. I'm kind of curious to see how you went for it. And then they went for it in ways that you can totally feel the cognitive dissonance, because they were all like, oh yeah, we're the best British citizens. We're so cool. We combine the best of the British Empire with the coolness of being Singaporean Chinese. I'm just like, guys, I understand from where you got this from, but to like 100 years from now, you're gonna look so weird.
Just like, stop, you're embarrassing.
Yeah. That's more of a like pejorative example, but then there's also like talking to people about urban legends. Being on Discord servers, talking to people about from different areas about urban legends. So talk to folks from Iceland who also say, yeah, there's just sometimes urban legends that are like, oh, these hills are not to be messed with. And I was like, oh yeah, there's like in Malaysia, there's don't mess with this bit of the jungle. It's not great. Or people like or talking to folks like from the Pacifica background who also mentioned, yeah, that there is some areas are more spiritual than other areas. So there's both commonalities and differences, and just differences in perspective. And I think part of that is just from historical research. You get used to seeing people who go through like approach similar problems with very different ideas. And also, I think as an experience of someone coming to the UK from Malaysia, where funny example, discovering why UK people talk about the weather all the time, because now I'm doing it. In Malaysia, you don't really talk about the weather that much because it's usually sunny or rainy or unseasoned or just warm. And then in the UK, it's like, this is how we make small talk. Yes, how is it sunny where you are? And then we all have like a 5-minute, slightly icebreakery discussion about, well, is it sunny? Has anyone won the lottery? Is it sunny today? And everyone going, no, it is not sunny today.
Rather than like the weather is interesting.
Yeah, it's like we're all preoccupied with how much sun we can stand in. Yes. Yeah.
This is what you're saying about like different angles and commonalities of legends. Because I was thinking that when you were saying like, oh, like the urban legend about like that inspired the night markets of selling salt to the dead, where I'm like, oh, that's so interesting because of other associations of salt with the dead or the undead or stuff. And I'm like, oh, I wonder what. I assume it's maybe like, I guess if I was doing origin guesses, I'd be like, oh, maybe something to do with like salt as a preservative, and that's why it has that link there, or something else. But it shows up in presumably very unlinked, lineage, but there's still this sort of commonality of like salt and death. There's a connection there.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, because there are lots of other places where even, and I think it's even trickled into like other folklore elsewhere, like the idea of salt lines and like lines of salt to keep things out or throwing salt over your shoulder. It was just, I think that one just stuck out to me because it was framed as like a man attempting a very ill-advised get rich quick scheme.
Yeah, the concept of the economy of the dead is very fascinating.
Yeah, and I suspect part of it comes from take this with a grain of salt. But I think the idea of like grave goods is a thing that just crops up in East Asian cultural stuff. I can only really speak from like observations of the Taoist Buddhist communities that were in my hometown area, where they would make during like a specific month of the 7th month of the lunar calendar, they would burn like paper goods, like paper effigies of items to send to their like ancestors and to their deceased family members in the afterlife. And that's like, it's just like, and usually it'd be things like paper houses and paper money, which implies like an economy of the dead. But they've modernized is the fun bit, and it's a really interesting bit. There were so yeah, the newspaper article I was reading about this mentions that now some like paper effigy shops also make paper iPads and paper iPhones.
That's fascinating. Paper Wi-Fi routers, like a paper internet of the dead.
Yes, like I think, yeah, and I think it comes from a place of like, yeah, wanting to share, like, I think that, I mean, if I had to hazard a guess, wanting to share like, the current joys of the modern day with like the deceased, because they were also burning things like paper Mercedes Benzes, where the car would be your paper car and it had Mercedes Benz logo on it, I think. Yeah,
this is really interesting. And I can also see, like, I know like old sort of like ancient Egyptian rituals often involve like being buried with like, or entombed with like earthly possessions. It's just an interesting comparison. So we've talked a lot about like the supernatural and the fantastical and the different urban legends and such that have informed your conception of that in your work and how you're interested in sort of sharing that. One thing I was curious about is you're one of the stretch goal writers on Death Game by Laurie O'Connell.
Yes.
I am as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I was interested because this is a foray into science fiction or a sci-fi adjacent space. And I was wondering, how does that change in focus feel?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting challenge. Like, there's definitely a shift in focus in terms of, like, I guess, the norms and motifs. But I think there's a shared the shared through line there, I guess, is just sometimes a lot of urban legends reflect anxieties that we have as a modern society. And I think that and I think Death Games especially fascinated me as a project because it was a very it was a big, like, nod, or like its theming is around a specific type of social, like, societal anxiety. And I think that was what fascinated me, was like what motivated me to, like, put a pitch in to write about it. So while I think, like, the trappings and the themings might not carry forward in the work I do, that sort of, I guess, trying to sort of, like, lean into, like, a specific social anxiety as a theme, I think continues to resonate. It's still something that carries over. So a lot of I think with the urban maw sort of adventure that sort of like arena that I'm writing for Death Games, a big theme of that, I think, was the idea of just like how societies like to put things into a little, society draws up like a model human, like a perfect archetypal ideal of what normal is. But real life is more complicated than that. And even the ways that people try to impose this normality can become absurd. They can become by themselves unusual. And this like irony, I think, yeah, this idea of irony and oddity continues. Even if the trappings may be less urban legend, supernatural, and more, sometimes the real horrors might just be people again. I will, however, note that there is still a moving, motile environment in the urban mall, because I cannot resist putting a horrible moving city in things. And look, okay, this is a bit of a funny one because it's not a standard sci-fi inspiration for the urban mall, but there was a webcomic called Girl Genius, which is a gas lamp science fantasy thing. So it bridges the gap between the more supernatural milieu I tend to work in with, like, a more sciencey style. And there was a whole arc that was just about a mad scientist, like, castle town that was built, which I think slowly, the imagery was, like, sporadic when I look back on it, but that idea fascinated me and stuck with me until I hit, like, the ideas for the urban mall, which was the idea of a city so built over and subject to the whim of a personality or architect that it could just shift at will. Like, I think in the comic, as, like, the city is besieged, you could see like shops being just like alleyways just becoming, like, traps that constrict and crush, like, people that were within the alley, like within, like, their confines. You could see walls flipping, statuary becoming animated, all reflecting the sinister personality that was Castle Heterodyne. And that, it came as a big fun arc moment because it was it was like, oh yeah, it was a very morbid art moment. But I think that kind of imagery stuck with me a bit, especially, like, as I like wander around cities and look at the built environment and see, like, yeah, these buildings were created by some kind of driving personality or force. It could be the municipal government really wants you to build this thing. It could be skyscrapers with big glass windows that send the sunlight directly into your eyeballs was trendy at the time. It could be this was the wax chandler's hall. They had specific tastes about how much wax chandler iconography needs to be in this building, right? Yeah. Sorry if I'm rambling a little. I think, yeah, I think the continued,
it's
like,
a very rambly podcast. It's all okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, but I guess the short form of it is, I think, while the sort of trappings and ideas might have to be modified, like general motifs might have to be modified for more sci-fi direction, I think the themes of, like, social anxieties, the idea of, like, a flourishing of life outside of a box of normalcy, and also the way people leave or have to deal with, like ideas contained in a built environment, continues. And it's a thing I'm fascinated with. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm really interested to read your arena when Death Game probably comes out, and interested to see the resonance with your other work, essentially. But that sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing the some of the inspiration for that in terms of like other media touchstones, which does bring me on to a next question, which is more sort of broad. It's phrased first as just like what reading informs your writing. We've obviously talked about a lot of reading in terms of stuff that informed Astonish, urban legends informing different things. I guess I was wondering, is there anything else that feels like interesting sort of touchstones? Or sometimes when I ask this question, I was like, have you ever noticed any reading that you feel might have influenced like the way you write in terms of like the voice you write in?
Okay, so the voice is gonna be a bit hard to pin down because I think there's a lot of influences, but I'll start with two-ish. One is I always make a point to continue reading like cool new works that pop up in the tabletop game scene to try and like get a sense of, oh, what is changing. So or what people are doing. So, every year I go to Dragon Beat and basically go riffling around and go, yes, these are cool, or this is neat, or I want to see how or this person's also doing like scary like ocean things. I want to see what they're doing. So I remember reading Chris Bissett's The Drowned Spire and going, oh, so that's an interesting way to do like a depth diving oxygenated, like that's how you like that's one way to wrangle it. Or say reading like when I was like exploring like what is going on with like say Powered by the Apocalypse, which was like a closer adjacent thing to Blades, and a lot of the like roll a d6 success failure success failure success with failure thing. So a lot of the technical writing I think influences on terms of like instructions or how to convey things or how to put things on a page. I think a lot of it does come from reading through tabletop games and trying to get a sense of, oh, okay, oh, that's a way to do it, or that's how you could place like a graphic and stuff like that. But to be honest, I have
I was just going to say, doing this podcast where I, by nature, do a lot of reading of lots of different people, when I'm really in the weeds of it, I am constantly like, I'm such a better writer for doing this podcast and reading widely. Like I was doing interview prep for someone, was reading a lot of their work, and then it just got me thinking about one of my own things and going like, yeah, this has made me realize there's something missing from that. I need to go and do some rewriting.
Yeah, like because like there's so many different people. I think everyone's got their own like specific motifs they like to do, and I've definitely seen that with, and even different scenes tend to have them. So it's cool going from like, this is more hexcrawl OSR scene. Okay, this is how they do space. This is how they do randomized procedures, to like say the PBT, the Powered by the Apocalypse, like Ray Najati sort of zone, where it's like, oh, okay, this is, you're going for archetypes, and it's interesting to see what you pick as archetypes to do your playbooks with, to try and make sure that everyone's still got cool bits for their character to bounce off of. But for a more writing-y style, I suspect, honestly, so there's a Southeast Asian writing corpus, like I think reading Zensho, I think, and just having a think about just I think that one gave more freedom. It was the RPG Southeast Asia folks, Zensho, other Southeast Asian writers. That one was more the joy of being able to go, oh wait, okay, no, people are writing about these things, and there's a cool, and they're thinking about these things. It's cool to see their perspectives on these things, because I have a very specific slice of the Malaysian person experience, and now it's like, oh, there's more slices of this pie, and it's just cool and encouraging. And then there's also Ursula Vernon stuff, and also Terry Pratchett's stuff. I read a lot of Terry Pratchett as like a teenager, and that sort of like absurd with a dash of like the absurdism of humanity. I think the dignity and absurdism of humanity energy. I think that came. I like that, and I sometimes try to borrow it a bit. Same thing with Ursula Vernon, who I think has a very Pratchetty energy, where she makes characters who feel like they have concerns alongside the narrative, but she's also like, I think in a shared way, in a way that I think might have rubbed off on me when I was reading her stuff, an enjoyable tendency to go into a bit of a digression on cool thing, or just a willingness to like go, no, this is like I'm trying to think of a good example. Yeah, and I think she like one of her books literally has like a mycologist just being written. Like, oh yeah, no, actually, this might be a better way to go about it angle wise. Ursula's work as T. Kingfisher has a lot of characters who are fascinated by a topic and are willing to pursue it quite intensely, and I think that kind of rubbed off on the way I write NPCs because exposition is always going to be a bit hard to convey. You're either doing it with the environment or you're doing it with people, and that idea of write and that informs how I write some side characters. It's just like this is a person who is doing their own thing. They happen to be here, and yeah, their job narratively is to deliver exposition, but that doesn't mean that they have to deliver it without bias or without at least two digressions into fun topic du jour that they enjoy. So yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to learn the sort of like everyone's sort of their own patchwork of interest of influences, and it's really interesting to learn about what you can see yourself there. Does music play much of a part of your creative process? Are you someone who writes with music or with sound, or other kind of accompaniments?
That's might be a little controversial, but the thing is, I think I tend to. I'm the kind of person who has a bit of trouble focusing with like I think music in the background, so I usually don't put it on when I work. Music crops up sometimes. Like there's definitely like I think sometimes when I do settings or think about ideas, there'll be like a little big collage of influences in my mind, and sometimes it is music related. But it's not like a guaranteed thing. So
it's not like I'm focusing on this. It's more that I guess if you're thinking about a place and an area and stuff, sometimes music is part of that, but not exclusively, not reliably guaranteed.
Yeah. Music also comes up sometimes when I'm running games for people. I think that's where it more comes up more often rather than when I'm designing because I guess I mean like honestly, I've seen people who write like full soundtracks for their like to go with their games. I salute these people because it's super cool. But I have such unusual music taste that I think at most if I had to mention something I'd be like it would just be a little sidebox going gamelan music is cool, please listen to it. Partially because I do not want to uh, admit to the fact that I am not a very cultured music person. Half of my playlist right now is video game music. Like pleasant video game music that I'm subjecting my players in my campaign to, but I don't know if it's everyone's cup of tea.
Sort of ambient. Yeah, I get you there. I was curious about how much you have like visual art and the visual look of stuff in mind during your writing process. You're obviously an illustrator yourself, and you've worked. You've talked recently about working with Molamute, which is a collaboration between another artist and yourself. Are you often thinking about? Are you thinking about basically visuals separately from your writing, or are they things that are very interlinked in your mind?
Oh yeah, no, they started out I think very interlinked because I think part of it is just that there's often a lot of times when I first started out when I was doing the layout on my own, and because of that it became a sort of I'm not sure how good a habit this is of just writing the thing a little bit, um, going into the layout software, twiddling until I've got an aesthetic I like or a layout I like, and then continuing to write the rest of the thing. So there were genuinely times when I'd be sitting there going, I could write this thing, or I could just write chunks of this thing, and then go hit the layout software and figure out, oh, do I have space for this, or does this feel like a good place to stop and start? And I don't know. I know like this is. I have seen tweets where people like comment in like it's an ambiguous it's like a there's an ambiguous like response to I write directly into Affinity Publisher, which I am guilty of. But yeah, like I think the art and feel is something I do think about, especially if I'm trying to make it more of a especially if I'm intending to make it a physical zine. Then it's like, oh yeah, someone's gonna hold it, they're gonna flip through it, it's gonna make it look nice. And art is a big part of that. So previously I've when I first started out, a lot of it was just public domain art. Thank you, public domain art. You have saved my bacon several times over. But now it's like being able to work with artists, like with Molamute for Whalefalls for the Whalefall zine. It was just cool. It's a different type of cool, but it's a coolness because it's like an exchange. It's being able to see, oh, this is how like being able to see like, oh yes, this is how a different perspective interprets this idea is always cool to me. Yeah, so I am sometimes worried though that as a consequence of the fact that like I have specific visual tastes and I think motifs. I sometimes worry that like the layout work I do might be a little not exactly stale, but like it rhymes. So I've always tried to make a point to go snoop and have a look at other layout and go, oh, okay, no, this is a good way to do text boxes, or, this person's using spot art interestingly. And I think I fold that into the design process of the book. But because how much spot art you need versus how much text you've got, and how you're going to convey maps and stuff, it all kind of coalesces together as part of the workflow. I probably could be more organized, but yeah, it's how it has
I
rolled.
can also see how my own writing has been like influenced and affected by having been like I am my own layout person always. And it's interesting because I feel like sometimes I do like writing like into layout or put something into layout in the middle of writing and then go back out just to see the shape of it. But also I definitely notice now more often like flagging stuff in the writing process for like the future layout version of me, where I'll just like write a comment on the doc being like, maybe throw this into like a sidebar text box, or maybe do this like a note from the editor, or have these all laid like. And so that's affected the writing, which obviously would never have been how I was operating at first, where I didn't have any understanding of layout.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
Actually,
it's interesting to track the development of it.
Yeah, and if you permit me to bring in something, I just because your mention of the way you do a workflow reminded me of a potential influence, which is so before I got into tabletop writing, a lot of the stuff I tended to do as a teenager was just draw things. I spent a lot of high school having this dream of doing a cool web comic or a cool comic, and then like following artists who would talk through their workflow as a comic book writer, and they would describe a very similar thing, which was, I'm gonna write the script and then I'm gonna make sure, because usually they'd be working with a separate illustrator if they were a writer, or they'd be working similarly, like there'd be artists them and writing them, and they go, right, this should be a big splash panel, or I want it to look like this thumbnail here. And I think, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that sort of following those artists around have rubbed off on the workflow, where I'm thinking, oh yeah, no, this spread, like put this whole map as a spread with like the words around it, it'd be cool. And I want to make sure, and that means I gotta make sure that all the writing for each section fits around the big art. Yes.
Yeah, totally. I definitely find myself thinking about like double page spreads and page turns in a way that I can tell is influenced by having read comic book scripts or having read interviews with comic book writers where they've discussed how they thought about like the physical structure of like a page in collaboration with like artists or such.
Yeah, I remember scrutinizing like so I read a lot of manga, and with manga it's like a different sort of right to left sort of thing. But I also remember following like less like slightly dodgy website scanlations of Karen Gillan's like Phonogram or the Young Avengers or the Wicked and the Divine. I had not been able to like. The problem is, you know, you don't really you're not able to get your hands on everything. But the scanlation people would be, this panel is a whole thing, isn't it cool? And you'd get like, oh wow, that's an interesting way they're making the motion read on like a big 2-pager of, say, like, oh, the Young Avengers coming in to like bust up a villain sort of like hideout, and it start from the top left and the action would go like around the page till you get to the bottom right.
Yeah. I also think like a lot of like back matter or commentary stuff in comic books, like when there's like, oh, this is a letter from the editor section, or this is the recap of what happened in last issue or stuff. Like, I think those are things I notice bringing into my layout, and yeah, I imagine that might be in the mix for you as well if you're also someone whose layout has been influenced by comic books. That does tie into the next question.
Yeah.
I had, which is sort of a like catch other things that may be disparate or I may not have thought to ask about, where it's like, have you ever noticed subtler influences from other mediums? So there we've talked about comic books, but I was wondering, are there any other mediums or art forms where you're like, oh, actually I'm drawing this in, which may not be obvious to other people?
Let me have a think. Okay, this one's So we've covered nonfiction, fiction, comics. I think we've covered like artists and illustrators as well. I guess the last one, which it's not as major, I think, in the stuff in the stuff I've currently released, but might end up coming up when I design encounters in adventures, because I've noticed this is something that is video games. This is so it's a bit less. So like I think I follow video games narratively. I like looking at, oh, this is what they're going for character design wise. This is how they're running a narrative that people play through. And I think that play through aspect helps inform, because I'd like say a fiction or non-fiction book, there's always going to be a bit of like a specific degree of player agency in adventures. So I think previously it was more tabletop games, fiction, non-fiction, etc. for games. But when it comes to like writing adventures, there's a lot of thinking through like and borrowing ideas from like say video game things in terms of like encounter design for adventures. So an example, this isn't specifically something that's released, but it was something I was thinking about when I was writing like campaigns for friends and things like that. Was I play like Final Fantasy 14, and there's a lot of dodging like area of effect markers, and that like I think that influence plus seeing friends test out similar like delayed area of effect markers that mess with the arena in encounters for more tactical games kind of impacted. So I think if it helps with an example, like say there was an encounter I was like running a little while ago that was on a ship where lines would appear at the start of each round, and at the start of the next round, your character, if you stood in it, would take damage. Sort of like so. Video games come in, I think, more in terms of not exactly mechanical things, but mechanical adjacent things. Oh, like this could be a cool way to change up the arena, or this because there's a different energy to the experimentation I see in video games where it's like the player where they create more interactables or additions, and I think while it's not a fully solidified influence, but it's something I've been chewing on. Same thing with say like adding a bit of a sort of mini gamey element to things, like with okay, I don't know how cool or how pretentious this will end up sounding, but in deaf games, one of the one of the like things I was puzzling through was like the idea of like one of the challenges being based around say a game show on how well do you know this city, and I was just thinking, oh yeah, that could be a mini game, but how do I get the questions? And one potential way to get the questions was to just go, hello folks, no matter what country you're playing in, please go look up a civics test and like try and answer like a bunch of questions from the civics test. And if you answer successfully, yay. If you don't answer successfully, because there'll always be things about our home country or the country we're living in right now that trip us up. Like I got tripped up by, well, age of like alcohol drinking in the UK or age of alcohol drinking in Malaysia, and it was just like, and it's like, oh yeah, if you pass, yay. If you fail, your character in deaf games gets fed to a slime mold, and they have to fight their way out, I guess. Yay.
Yeah, definitely like civics as well, because they're actually really opaque if you've maybe just been not if you've not necessarily studied for them either. So that could be, and it's that whole area of almost like mini game sub mechanics in adventure writing, which definitely relates to that thing of why I'm like, I can see totally how like designer writer in this role is just completely sort of integrated. But also, it's really interesting that influence from video games in a way that's not. I feel often when some people talk about like influence from video games, they more mean like the story from a video game or this setting or the way this felt, whereas that's actually way more like encounter design, like essentially how user interface is being conveyed. It's really interesting.
Yeah,
I sometimes think.
Yeah,
I sometimes end up thinking that like a lot of the way I write adventures or scenarios is really influenced by like reading walkthroughs of like video game RPGs, where it's like, oh, if you're in this place and talk to this person and say this thing might happen. But also, if you say this other thing, I'm like, I think some of that is often how I approach writing that. It's probably just like really based off a formative experience of reading like Fallout 3 walkthroughs, because I needed to know how to blow up or not blow up a place. It just made me think of that because it's another video game influence that is not direct and is not often what people talk about. But when you were talking about like scenario and encounter design, I'm like, oh yeah, that's how I work in that space sometimes.
Oh yeah, now that you mentioned the guides, you have activated a very funny core memory, which was one of the first Nintendo DS games I ever played was, I think, Pokemon Pearl, and it came, and I think the relative who passed that like secondhand DS on to me and my sister also passed us the gameplay guide, which was infinitely more fascinating for me at the time. The gameplay, like a full large almanac of every route in Pokemon Pearl, every Pokemon you could find in Pokemon Pearl, with like little illustrations of the full map. So I'd be watching. So like, I didn't really like random encounters as a kid, as like when I was playing that. So there was just a time when I was just staring at it going, oh, okay, cool. So that's how you do that route. That's how you get through the cave with the minimal amount of steps likely to provoke a Zubat. And it just had like lots and lots of. I think, yeah, those guides were just so cool. They were very illustrated. They had character splash art. They had little tidbits about, oh, Route 118 is where you have honey trees. Huh. Yeah.
It's such a strange thing, which I guess you still... It's more, I guess, just different now than those guides, but it's interesting to think on. So I've really enjoyed having you on the show, and if anyone is listening to this and is not already following you and would like to be doing so because they've heard about all of your wonderful work and are like, I got to check all this out, where can they do so? Where's the best places to follow you, both on itch and whatever social media you're floating around on?
Okay. I think given the relative chaos around social media at the time, yes. Safest place to go currently would be my itch. So it would be Yanahn. It is just Yanahn on the itch.io like page. So wait, let me yeah, so I think if you type Yanahn and then itch.io, it should turn up. Or if not, I think it'll come up in the search bars. And
I'll have a link in the episode description as well.
Oh yeah, that's probably the safest place, because when you get onto my page, there'll be links to my social medias. I'm currently active on platform formerly known as Twitter, so that's where you can find me as KristenChin8. And I'm exploring Blue Sky and working through a bunch of other like platforms as well. I have a Tumblr. Actually, I have a Tumblr, but I think you can probably find a link to that on the itch page as well. That one is... I'm a bit leery of linking to it because on one hand, I have like Yanahn blog, which is officially more tabletop games related things. But on the other hand, there's also like the personal Tumblr I've held for like 8 years and counting. So I'll use the itch. That's where all the stuff is.
I don't like the idea of everyone moving to Tumblr. I don't want to have to remake. Well, also, I do not want people following me on... Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, itch definitely best place. And also, if you click follow on itch, you will get an email notification anytime Yanahn releases anything. So that's really bad. Thank you again.
That's the best place.
It's been a really interesting conversation. What I like to ask as a sort of wrap up is, what do you think is the biggest lesson you've learned from creating TTRPGs?
Honestly, I think, thinking on it, I think it's the biggest lesson is... Okay, this is a bit of a cliche, but it's just that there is always room to grow and learn. The scene is ever changing. There's new ideas and new approaches coming up every time. Every time I go to like a convention or a gathering of tabletop creators or just any tabletop thing in general, I meet new people with new perspectives, or see old friends who've just come up with this cool new idea. And I think that is my biggest lesson. There's always room to grow, to learn, to try and experiment new things. I think that was one of the things that drew me to the indie scene. There's so much room for experimentation, and there is, especially since like I have some space to do this as like an experimental like hobby and interesting art form, to keep like an awareness that there should be a joy that comes from these projects. because I think right now in the world, it's really easy to, I think, feel like everything has to be, you know, a commodity, and that's fine. Like, I'm not just like, we live in, this society, and sometimes you do have to make it like a commodity. You do have to think of your stuff as a commodity if that is like specific to your situation, all that. But for me, at least personally, having a joy of creation, of being able to discuss things with friends, discuss things with peers, exchange ideas, I think that's probably kept things going the longest. Being able to see what's out there and keep learning, I guess. Yeah, it's a bit
Thank
fluffy,
you.
but that's yeah.
I mean, that's the point. I think if you ask someone what's the biggest, like, it's always going to be something like that. But thank you for sharing. I do appreciate that. And thank you to listening to the reader.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really appreciate you having me on here. And thank you all to the listeners as well.
Yeah. This has been The Life Path of Yanahn. I have been Kayla Dice. Thank you for listening. Good night.